Now we're live.
Now official.
Maybe we ought to talk briefly, and Kevin, I don't know that you know the history of this, but about sort of why we're here and the scholarship funds created by HWA, and that it's a good cause. Lisa, I think the first scholarships were under your stewardship of HWA, and we started with the Wollstonecraft Scholarship, Mary Shelley. We have the Rocky Wood Scholarship. Go ahead.
I believe our first two actually may have been set up under Rocky, who was the president of HWA just before I stepped in 2015. The first two were the HWA Scholarship, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley Scholarship. When I became president in 2015, we added a few others. We had a generous donor who enabled us to set up the Rocky Wood Memorial Nonfiction Scholarship. We have the Dark Poetry Scholarship. And since I left office, we've added some other wonderful scholarships. I believe there's now diversity grants. There's the Dennis Etchison award for young writers. There is the one that goes to libraries, and then there is the Scholarship from Hell, which funds full tuition for one person to attend StokerCon each year. That one, of course, is closed because we just had StokerCon a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I think we should stress that these are not giveaways. These are not prizes. These are designed to encourage specific kinds of activities, and one applies for them, and there are committees that judge them and so on. But it's really what we're all about. We are primarily an educational organization designed to promote and foster the genre of horror and dark fantasy, and scholarship about that is part of it. So.
And I can confirm they make a difference as the first recipient of the Rocky Wood Scholarship. So that really helped me out to publish a book.
So Kevin and I are here to listen to you talk, Lisa, for an hour about Halloween. So
we represent the audience and the everyman characters as you hold forth, O Queen of Halloween.
Well, we should probably start by introducing ourselves. I am Lisa Morton. I am an author of both fiction and nonfiction. I've written 3 books on the history of Halloween and have been a talking head in lots of silly documentaries about it on the History Channel and the Travel Channel and all that kind of thing. And I apologize for the fact that I am getting over a slight cold, so I'm a little hoarse and will try not to wheeze too much today. And Kevin, why don't you tell us who you are and why you're here?
I'm Kevin Wetmore, the author of a lot of nonfiction and some fiction. I am also the curator of HWA's Halloween Haunts, and have written a number of articles and a number of podcast episodes about the history of Halloween and things like Halloween sadism and Devil's Night, known as Gate Night or Cabbage Night or Mat Night, depending on what part of the country you live in. So I'm sort of fascinated by the history of the epiphenomenon of Halloween, which Lisa is also an expert in. So I'm just here to listen to her and steal ideas. And to my side here, or actually it's this side on here, is the eminent Les Klinger.
Thank you. And I am a lawyer by day, which has something to do with Halloween, but we won't get into that, I think, in this session. Something about blood sucking and all those things. But by night, I am the editor of a number of nonfiction books and a number of anthologies together with Lisa Morton, in which we've collected a lot of classic horror fiction. So I've been a scholar and fan of the horror genre for many years.
All right. And I thought there were a couple of topics I had in mind today. I know this discussion itself is called A Brief History of Halloween. Obviously, it would have to be very brief, but I understand, or I'm going to guess that a lot of the people who will listen to this either currently as it is live streaming or in the recorded version will be writers who might be wondering about using Halloween in their work. And I actually have written an article exactly on that appeared in the HWA newsletter a few years ago. But I thought I would address a couple of those points right off the bat because they also do tie into the history of the holiday. I have a couple of pet peeves as a Halloween expert when it comes to Samhain. And I'm assuming you all know that that is spelled Samhain, and it is not pronounced Samhain. Please do not name a character Samhain and think it's cute because it's been done to death. And that's number one of my pet peeves. But number two is that Samhain is often used in incorrect ways, and we owe much of that to 19th century scholars and so-called historians who romanticized and exoticized indigenous peoples, including the early Celtic tribes who were in Ireland. I have a lovely 19th century engraving that you can find via my website that shows these dancing people around a fire, and the caption reads something like "crazed orgies of the Druids." The truth is that when it comes to Samhain and our understanding of what it meant to the Celtic tribes, we know very little about it. What we have comes down to us via Catholic missionaries who recorded the early lore of the Celtic people, and some archaeological evidence. So when you see something in a book or even in an article like Trick or Treat dates back to Druid priests dressing in bear skins, no, it doesn't. The fact is we have no evidence whatsoever to support the idea that Druids spent Samhain dressed in bear skins, that there was any kind of house-to-house begging ritual, that there was obviously wild dancing around bonfires. What we do know about Samhain in regards to the Celts is that it was probably a 3-day celebration for them. It was the end of the year, so they celebrated it with administrative duties as well, things like collecting taxes and reestablishing the house fire. But they told ghost stories. And some of those ghost stories are awesome. You can read them in those early collections of Celtic lore and fairy tale and myth. Some of them are still genuinely weird and scary. There is one, for example, about a warrior who was sent out by the king on Samhain night to tie. He is given a dare that no one has been able to accomplish yet. He's asked to tie a loop or a cord around the foot of a hung corpse. I should say a hanged corpse, I guess. The other one might get dicey. And he can't do it, and he tries and tries, and for some reason every time he tries to slide this cord onto the foot it slips off, and he finally gets it around the foot of this corpse, and the corpse comes to life and says, "I'm very thirsty, I died, I was hanged here, I'd like to get some water." And so our warrior agrees to take this living corpse to the nearest house, something to drink, and when it arrives at the house, the corpse takes the drink, spits the fluid in the faces of all the people in the house, and they all die horribly. I mean, you can't beat that almost in modern horror literature. So that is, I believe, where Halloween gets its macabre side from. And that is the way I would love to see writers use Samhain in fiction.
So Halloween is one of really, aren't there 3 big nights during the year? There's St. George's Day, at the eve of St. George's Day. There's Walpurgisnacht, and then there's Halloween. And they're all Saints' Days. They're all basically the nights before Saints' Days, right?
Well, if you're talking in the Celtic calendar, there are 4 quarterly holidays. The 2 biggest are probably Beltane, which is on the flip side of the calendar, starts on the evening of April 30th, goes through to May 1st. And then Samhain, of course. And the other 2, and I know I'm horribly mispronouncing these, are Imbolc, which is in February, and Lughnasadh in August. So they're set at 3-month intervals. Now, obviously, in the Catholic Church, there are a lot of those crazy kind of midsummer St. George days. The Catholic side of Halloween was All Saints' Day, which, by the way, they moved. It was originally on May 13th, which was the date of an old Roman festival of the dead. And I am one of those who believes that they moved it to November 1st to try and co-opt Samhain. Because they were having a hard time with those old Celts up there in Ireland. And there's debate over that. There are people who believe that they moved it to that date from May to accommodate pilgrims who were coming to Rome, and that was the end of harvest. So they had a lot of food. I believe I go with the Samhain side because, like I said, to me, that's where Halloween gets the macabre side from.
Well, my point or question was, though, that I mean, there are 4 dates, I think, that are associated with spirits having great power. Halloween is just one of them.
Right. Yeah. There again, if now you're kind of getting into some of the pagan holidays and so forth, and I think there are 8 Sabbats in the pagan calendar. But yes, it is one of the days. The two principal days for the spirits were Beltane and Samhain. Beltane is also known as Walpurgisnacht or Witch's Night.
Hey, Les, watch me drive Lisa crazy. Hey, Lisa, I hear the Romans started Halloween with Pomona.
You've done it. That was all it took. I'm out of here. That is an oft-repeated error. That's another one that I like to caution writers on, because that one got repeated a lot. And it's interesting that following the evolution of that mistake through the 20th century, it doesn't start in the 19th, it starts in the 20th. And, excuse me, you see it come up first in this book. This is sort of the Bible of Halloween history books. This is the first real history of Halloween, 1919, Ruth Edna Kelly's The Book of Halloween. She addresses Pomona in a very oblique manner. She does not come right out and say it is part of the history of Halloween. She uses it to talk about myths involving harvest and autumn and so forth. But somehow people took it from her and expanded it into this crazy notion that Halloween is based in part on a Roman holiday celebrating the goddess Pomona. Pomona was not, in fact, a goddess. She had no holiday, and there is no major holiday in that year at that part of the year in the Roman calendar. So that is another one of the misconceptions that I see passed around a lot.
I would argue it's actually been perpetuated quite a bit by these so-called learning channels, the History Channel. There's not all those Halloween specials on the various educational cable networks, starting in the late 80s and early 90s. And Lisa, I know you've been on some of those, where they'll have on an expert. It's like, oh, and Pomona was the Roman goddess of the harvest, and that's where Halloween began. And if you hear someone saying that, you may ignore everything they say.
Yes, indeed. And laugh at them, please.
Indeed.
Well, then, I mean, when did the big change occur that it started to become what I describe as a hallmark holiday, a holiday that became heavily commercialized and sort of civilized?
That starts obviously in the 20th century, as all things involved with commercializing and merchandising do, I think. The history in between is that it became a part of later Irish and Scottish culture. Even though they were converted by the Catholic missionaries, they kept a lot of that old Celtic tradition and lore. And Samhain, they loved Samhain. And it became a big part of the mythology and folklore clear up through into the 20th century. So when the Scottish and Irish came to America in the 19th century, they brought this celebration with them. And they celebrated it at that point with parties, and they told fortunes. That was a big part of Halloween. If you read the descriptions of the parties from that time, they actually sound really fun. They played games, they told fortunes, they ate all kinds of special foods, they flirted with each other. They are genuinely very fun, and Americans took to that part of it. And in the 19th century, you get new technologies of printing, which means that suddenly America is flooded with magazines. And the middle-class matrons were reading these magazines and reading these quaint little descriptions of these parties and going, oh, that sounds delightful. My children would love that. And then by the time you get into the early 20th century, now everything is starting to get much more marketed. And we start to get companies like Denison's was a paper manufacturing company that came in and manufactured decorations and costumes. and they made paper masks for people. And there were companies that started making candies for people. And one of the most fun things now about Halloween collecting is the early postcards. For about a 30-year period from about 1910 to around 1930 or so, maybe not even 30 years, postcards were the main way people communicated with each other just before the telephone came in. And there were around 3,000 unique Halloween postcards produced by the major companies at that time. They are absolutely gorgeous, many of them. They are now major collectibles, and they give us a delightful picture of what Halloween was like and how it was transforming. You start to get the colors orange and black are now accepted as the standard colors of Halloween because of these decorating companies. Before they came along, you can find very early guides that will say the standard colors of Halloween are yellow and brown, because that was what was associated with harvest, with corn and with hay and so forth that was coming in at the time. But these decorating companies picked up on the huge popularity of the big carved pumpkin, which of course is orange.
And when did that come along? When did the pumpkin sort of get associated with Halloween?
Right around 1900. It had been used before that. The Irish who came over into America loved to carve turnips. They had huge turnips in Ireland that they would carve. Of course, they didn't have pumpkins. So again, if you read a story in which somebody is in Ireland in 1790 and they're carving a pumpkin, you can call them on it. They had these turnips, and they would carve those into pranks that they would play on Halloween night. They would carve a spooky face into it, and it would become Jack the Trickster, who was a character at the source of dozens of folktales throughout the UK and the Europe and America as well. And they might do something like tie a string to that carved turnip and pull it on Halloween night. So you suddenly see this glowing face that's trailing off in through the shadows. And when they arrived in America and found these gorgeous, huge pumpkins, of course, those were way better than turnips. They started carving them, but it's interesting that if you look at early pictures of kids like carving pumpkins and so forth in America, you realize they're not actually related to Halloween. It was just kids playing pranks. And it's not until kind of the end of the 19th century that we start to get these early party guides that will tell us that pumpkins are just one of the things you can carve into jack-o'-lanterns. They also suggest, and don't ask me how they did this, things like apples and cucumbers. I can only assume they had way better carving tools and a lot more time than we do.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa. One of the things that I find fascinating about this transition is it goes from what is essentially a family, even an adult holiday with the Irish, to America makes it a children's holiday. Particularly in the 20s and 30s, and then it won't be again until the 70s and 80s that it gets marketed to adults again and is now second only to Christmas in terms of money spent on celebrating the holiday.
Yeah, you nailed it, Kevin. Yeah, exactly right. It is marketed for children throughout most of the 20th century, and as you put it, up until about the 1970s. And that gets us into what I call the golden age of trick-or-treat, which is that whole kind of mid-20th century period from around 1950 to about 1970. That is when the companies like Hershey's and were coming in and manufacturing candy, because up until then, people celebrating trick-or-treat had made their own treats. They were making popcorn balls and candied apples. And of course, that was a humongous chore. So housewives loved it when these wrapped candies came in, and kids loved it because, hey, chocolate. And then we have these companies like Collegeville coming in and manufacturing costumes. And this was a really interesting new turn in the merchandising, because now they were manufacturing costumes that tied into things like comic books and television shows. So when you were a kid in like 1958 or something, and you didn't want to be another gypsy dressed out of, and I'm sorry, I used the G word, you didn't want to be another hobo or something dressed out of the old scavenged clothes your mom had stuffed in the attic. Now you could be Captain Kangaroo. You could be Donald Duck. You could be Superman. I mean, what kid didn't want to be those things as compared to just one more, oh, great, Aunt Bessie's old dress from 1920, you know? So merchandising was huge during this time. And I had mentioned earlier I was going to bring some toys. One of the things I love to collect from this period is noisemakers.
Mhm.
These were classic during this sort of golden age of trick or treat. They made hundreds of these because one of the things that kids loved to do when they were trick or treating was also make a heck of a lot of noise. These things are insanely noisy. This is a tambourine. This one is one of my more interesting pieces because this is a very early piece. This actually is from like 1920, and this probably precedes Trick or Treat because Trick or Treat didn't catch on really until just before World War II. Then it kind of went on pause, and then it picked up again after World War II. And before Trick or Treat, kids were playing pranks, and one of the things, of course, that kids love to do when they play pranks, again, make a lot of noise. This one, you can tell it's very old because it has an actual wooden ball and a little wooden end here. And you can hear that these things make a heck of a lot of racket. So these were very popular items for probably 50 years. I mean, obviously, there's still like party noisemakers made for Halloween parties and so forth. But these are also great because of the iconography on them. They really capture the look of the holiday. They always feature jack-o'-lantern faces, black cats, bats, witches. They're just often beautiful to look at, way more, of course, than they are to hear.
It's interesting to see how this is a distortion of the scaring away of spirits, which was what, was really going to go on All Hallows Eve. It was the time to put up your garlic and hang your wolfsbane and all that good stuff to protect your household and make noise. Because
what's interesting about that is that sort of derives from yet another holiday we haven't mentioned, which was All Souls Day. All Souls Day was instituted by the Catholic Church around the 11th century. And it seems, again, there's a lot of speculation that one of the reasons they added a holiday on November 2nd, one day after All Saints Day, was to co-opt Samhain, to continue with that, managing to convert those Celts. And the reason they gave was that so many of their parishioners had complained about the fact that, hey, we celebrate all the saints on November 1st. What about our own loved ones? So that was the other reason they gave for All Souls Day. And the idea with All Souls Day was that you were praying for your loved ones who were trapped in purgatory. So it was a little bit macabre. And over the years, it took that macabre element and transformed that into witches are going to attack our farm on the eve of All Souls Day, and we have to do whatever we can to protect our farms. They would go into the fields with things like lit torches that they would hold up, and with the idea that it would keep the witches flying overhead.
And it worked.
It worked, yes. Except
just
I wonder
how many garlic works,
How many set their own fields on fire, I've wondered. But so that notion of like scaring away evil spirits on Halloween actually may come down more from All Souls Day than anything else. And yes, you're right. It is funny that Trick or Treat kind of almost inadvertently co-opted that and flipped it around.
I knew that we were right to TP people's houses, that it was about keeping away spirits, They couldn't appreciate that, but that's what we were really doing. Well, it's interesting. So we should talk a little bit, I think, probably about Halloween in literature and sort of what use has been made of it in the past by others. We know the things we don't want them to do.
Yes, indeed. I'm sure everyone has a favorite Halloween book or story just because so much of it has been written now. It has become obviously such a standard part of the sort of horror writing catalog that we all draw from. And I'll just mention a couple of my favorites. Obviously, we all have to start with Ray Bradbury when we're talking about Halloween fiction. Although it is not sort of directly dealt with in Something Wicked This Way Comes, that always feels like such a classic Halloween story. And of course, later on, he wrote The Halloween Tree, which is the most gorgeous, poetic sort of fictional version of Halloween ever written, I think. But slightly more contemporary one that I absolutely love is a very, very long short story by Glenn Hirschberg called Mr. Dark's Carnival. It is not directly related to Bradbury's Something Wicked, despite the title, but if you can seek that out and find it, it is an amazing short story.
One of the things that I found amazing, and again, Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, how much early Halloween literature was actually poetry. That you've got Robbie Burns, you've got H.P. Lovecraft writes a Halloween poem, Halloween in a Suburb, that you don't really start getting full-length Halloween fiction until early mid-20th century. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. So the oldest one I have, I brought visual aids, is Charles Williams' All Hallows Eve, which was published in 1945, and sort of touches upon Halloween. For me, and again, as a child of the 80s, one of the very first fights I remember having with my mother, speaking of that's a child of the 70s and 80s, was Spider-Man does not walk around with a picture of Spider-Man on a vinyl smock. And then the following year, Dracula does not walk around with a picture of Dracula. I have the Dracula mask, and then the face is also right here. Dracula doesn't wear his own merch. And yet that's what was available to kids in the 70s. I have a soft spot, like many horror writers do, for vintage paperbacks with titles like Halloween. That's a good one. David Robbins is a triple threat. He gives us Halloween. There we go. And then he gives us Prank Night. Spook Night. If there's a night, David Robbins has written about it. All these Halloweens. Lisa Cantrell has a whole bunch of books set on Halloween. The three that I would recommend, because I want to be respectful of time, Cemetery Dance. Well, Richard Lehman put out several books set on Halloween, including, to the best of my knowledge, his only children's book, The Halloween Mouse, which is about a mouse that lives in a jack-o'-lantern, and one of my daughter's favorites. Cemetery Dance also put out Trick or Treat, a collection, I'm getting reflection here, sorry, a collection of Halloween novellas, which is a lot of fun. And then for my money, if you're going to get anything, find copies of these two. October Dreams, a celebration of Halloween, which Lisa is in, I believe.
I'm in volume 2.
Volume 2, which is also here from Cemetery Dance. This one, the original, contains two of my favorite Halloween stories of all time. Dean, and again, because of when I read them as a subscriber to Cemetery Dance, not Cemetery Dance, excuse me, as a subscriber to Twilight Zone in the 1980s for the duration of that magazine. Dean Koontz is The Black Pumpkin, which chilled me as a 12-year-old. And then John Skipp's The Spirit of Things, which still, when I think about it, really disturbs me. It asks the question, what would happen if all the ghosts and monsters were real and Halloween pissed them off because they were tired of seeing us dress up like Casper the Friendly Ghost or, Sexy Sailor? What would these beings do to take back their night? And every time I think about that, I think I'm going to go down to the basement and not talk to people for a few days because the results are profoundly disturbing, and Skip does a lovely job. But again, holding it wrong, October Dreams 1 and 2. Celebration of Halloween. It's got fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and there's a lot of great Halloween poetry out there. I want to give a shout out to the poets paying attention. Your work is awesome, and there's a lot of it. Les, what are your favorites?
Well, I there's no particular book. The Dracula doesn't get to Halloween, but there are other nights. Walpurgis Nacht is an important night in the story, and so on. But I'm a big fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I'm a huge fan of Buffy. I've always wanted to do a scholarly book about Buffy. Nancy Holder has, of course, done a wonderful series of books about them. But in the Buffy universe, it's interesting that you mentioned John Skipp's story. The vampires and everybody, they all stay home on Halloween.
They take Halloween off. I love that about the series. I'm going to stay home, make some popcorn, and just watch TV. This is a busy night for everyone else.
Absolutely. They just, they sort of, it would be wrong to be out there with all the crowds. It's not that it's wrong. It's just sort of pointless. They seem to think it wouldn't scare anybody if they were out there.
Well, that kind of leads me to segue into Halloween on television and film. It has an interesting history on television. It was there early on. with I think one of the earliest ones I found was 1955, I think it is, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet did a Halloween episode, which you can still find on YouTube. And it looks very different from our Halloween. I mean, these kids come and knock on the door, and it's broad daylight, and they're wearing these kind of weird-looking little outfits, and it's the whole thing is just not. I'm not even sure they say trick or treat, but and then of course in the '60s it becomes very popular. One of the key elements in that was the animated "It's the Great Pumpkin" Charlie Brown, which also birthed the great age of Halloween children's books. There were virtually none before that, which is interesting. And after that, there was just a flood of them, and there still is now.
Star Trek has a Halloween episode, Robert Bloch's Cat's Paw, which, again, the racism that Spock had to deal with always breaks my heart. But at one point, he's like, Halloween, Captain, what's trick or treat? He's like, oh, you would fit right in, Spock. I'm like,
Yeah.
imply that Spock looks like he's wearing a Halloween costume? Okay. But they even say throughout it, they keep talking about Halloween and say, well, was this a trick or a treat? And I took comfort, again, at the tender age of 11 or 12, that 300 years in the future, Halloween still exists. We're still aware of it.
I'm thinking about something you said about I mean, I'm, without revealing my exact birth date, I was trick-or-treating in the 50s as a young child. I was probably, I was 10, 11 years old maybe. And one of the things that I remember distinctly was Trick or Treat for UNICEF.
Uh-huh.
We had little milk cartons that we walked around with. They had a little sort of orange wrapper, and you collect pennies and turn it into schools. It was like, I don't know, maybe it was pretty weird. It seems weird now, but
it was very popular for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, Kevin, I'm just thinking back to you talking about the Star Trek episode and the Kirk throwing the little shade at Spock with the comment about you'd fit right in. Well, look who became the killer's mask in Halloween, Bill.
I'm glad you brought up Halloween, because that's one of the films that struck me how film very rarely used Halloween, especially horror films very rarely used Halloween until, of course, Carpenter and Deborah Hill come along, and suddenly the holiday explodes. And from there, we have now dozens, if not hundreds, of Halloween films, but very few before that.
Yeah, indeed. They're the first ones I found were weirdly enough released in the same year. 1943, we got the arrival of both Meet Me in St. Louis, which has a whole prolonged section involving a very early Halloween with prank playing and kids running around out in the street committing mischief and so forth. No mention of trick or treat, which is appropriate. And Arsenic and Old Lace, which was rewritten to incorporate Halloween in a way that the stage play did not include. I think that was testament to the fact that the holiday was starting to catch on at that time. And then, there isn't a lot throughout the 50s and the 60s. And then in 78, here comes a guy who's going to make a movie called The Babysitter Murders. And fortunately, whether it's his producer or who it was, I don't know, there's a lot of back and forth on that. But somebody is smart enough to go, hey, you know what? This holiday. And they rename it smartly to Halloween, and they include all of the iconography. And that is one case of a film, just a movie, that had a humongous, explosive impact on popular culture. I actually date the film's transition to a fully adult holiday with the release of that film. It was going on before that in the 70s because of counterculture groups and so forth, but that movie just made it way too scary for kids, and now adults really claimed it. And yes, and you're right, after that we get the explosion of Halloween-themed films and so forth, and with a lot of that coming back full circle almost to the Nightmare Before Christmas, which makes the holiday, again, whimsical and magical and lovable.
Another film that didn't do great when it first came out, but has since exploded, is Hocus Pocus.
Right.
Set in Salem on Halloween, and is now, as a teacher of college students, they sort of grew up with it. Their parents showed it to them. It's one of my wife's favorite films. Every year we take the kids to see it somewhere. The other horror film that comes to mind with Halloween, and it's a blink and you miss it moment, is actually The Exorcist.
Yeah.
Simply because what not a lot of people remember or realize is the first day of that film is Halloween, when
Yeah.
Chris McNeil is walking home from the film set. Again, blink and you miss it. Some leaves skitter by, and kids run by in costumes, and they're clearly dressed for Halloween. And that's the only mention made of Halloween in the film. But it's right there at the beginning. The Exorcist begins on Halloween.
Indeed.
So
And in fact, when I saw it, when it was first released, I immediately thought, why isn't Reagan out trick-or-treating?
Movie star kid. She
Yeah.
just has candy brought to her.
So Lisa, Halloween turned dark for kids sometime in the, I don't know when. There was parents were suddenly afraid about razor blades in the apples, poison, ricin, strange poisonous substances. When did that happen?
1980s. In fact, I can date it specifically. 1983 is when it began, for two reasons. And again, Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert. One is the increase in Devil's Night. That's the first night that Detroit saw hundreds of fires lit on the night before Halloween. And then that's also, it starts actually late 70s, where a kid was poisoned on Halloween. And it turned out that it was his dad that did it. But immediately we have what sociologists call Halloween sadism, the fear that people are putting razor blades and needles and all that. And it's by the early 80s that you have local dentists and local police stations saying, bring your candy in and we'll x-ray it to make sure there's nothing in there, and you have to examine it. And it just, when you do a survey, there's only maybe one or two examples of actual Halloween sadism where people gave stuff to strangers. Most of the time it was someone accidentally gave out their own stash. They're like, oh, where's my heroin? I put it in the trick-or-treat bowl. That was probably a bad idea. But there are one or two cases where it was intentionally trying to harm strangers. But man, America, especially in the 80s, loves public panics and moral panics. Did you also know Satanist ruled America back then?
Yeah, that's true. It actually did start earlier in the 70s, and it was a case called the Candy Man. And it was a guy down in Texas who ran an insurance scheme involving poisoning his own son with arsenic-laced pixie sticks. And that actually coincided with something else that was going on in America about the same time, which was this mass scare that there had been poisoned or tampered with bottles of, I think it was Tylenol. So those two things combined, and I think it was about 73, 74, really set off the beginning of, kind of lit that fuse of, oh, wait, this is not safe for kids anymore. And like I said, for me, the release of Carpenter's Halloween is what really kind of full tilt. It's all over now for the kids, although it's not, of course. It survived because it's just too much fun. Although I do feel sorry for the modern kids who have to go out with their parents on Halloween night, because we didn't have to.
Well, the other thing that you see happen in the 80s is this sort of explosion of anti-Halloween, particularly from the Christian right. The idea that Halloween is the devil's holiday. And so without pointing anything out, we have a neighbor who on Halloween, the very Christian neighbors just leave their lights out and don't go near them. But there are some who will sit outside and give out chick tracts or Bible tracts or, Jesus loves you pencils, to encourage you to rethink this horrible lifestyle choice of participating in trick-or-treating, because it is actually a tool of Satan designed to lead you away from the one true faith. And what is essentially a harmless children's party, and truth be told, the most communal holiday event we have in America. Christmas, Thanksgiving are spent with family and friends. The 4th of July is second after Halloween, I think, just because you come together to look at sky flowers and listen to loud patriotic music while things explode above you. But Halloween is when you go to your neighbors' homes, admittedly in disguise as the Mandalorian, and they have to give you food. And that's the most communal holiday we have. It's wonderful. And the response is, this is actually a tool of Satan. It's designed to introduce you to Harry Potter and witchcraft. And when you go back and read chick tracts, if you celebrate Halloween, this very quickly leads to murder, Satanism, homosexuality, and feminism. I'm actually quoting there. Celebrating Halloween leads to all those things.
You mean that's not true?
I mean, it is, but it's not the only thing.
By the way, there's an interesting historical point. We can trace this idea that Halloween celebrates the devil's birthday back to a very specific moment in history. because that was something I really dug into when I did my book, Trick or Treat: A History of Halloween. I started to wonder, where did this idea come from that, oh, thank you. You're far better prepared than I am. Where
You
did
should
this
also
idea
get this
come
one if you're
from?
looking at Lisa Morton Halloween books. The Halloween Encyclopedia. Since we're talking for writers here, we're talking to writers. This should be on your shelf if you're going to write about Halloween.
Or borrow it because it's now insanely expensive. But
Fair enough.
this notion that I hear this is something you hear a lot, is that it's the devil's birthday. It's based on an ancient Celtic worship of Samhain, the Lord of Death. And I thought, where the heck did that come from? I found out this dates back to the 18th century when there was a surveyor named Charles Vallancey who was working for the British government. He was sent to Ireland to survey Ireland, create maps and so forth, but he became obsessed with Celtic culture while he was there. And he wrote everything down and he explored all aspects of it, the language and the archaeology and the fairy tales. He collected all of his lore into these 6 volumes that are called something like the Collectanea Hibernicus or something. Anyways, this is all very well and good, except this man, Charles Vallancey, was an absolute fool. He was derided by every single other historian at the time. They called him something like the greatest fool to ever write on history or something. And he just arbitrarily made things up. He just made stuff up. He decided that Samhain, which at that point had been translated for centuries, it was universally acknowledged to mean summer's end in the Celtic language, that it referred to an ancient Indian deity that had a slightly similar name. So he said, well, this obviously means that they worship the Lord of Death, and it's crazy stuff. But those books made their way into libraries and bookshelves all over the world. And you can draw a direct line from those to this modern idea that celebrates evil and the Lord of Death and Satan's birthday and blah, blah, blah. And I'm always so tempted to go up to these people and say, no, you're honoring a mistake. Don't do it. But of course, I know how well that's likely to go.
Little known fact, Samhain, god of death, is the husband of Pomona, goddess of the harvest.
Yeah, exactly.
We should point out, by the way, that if you have questions for us, you can post them in the comments and we can actually read them. But it is a celebration of that stuff, at least when we get serious about it. Yes, it was a harvest festival. That is to say, there was a harvest festival at the same time, but it was also historically a date when the spirits were most active and one had to take steps to combat them. And so it's not a celebration of the devil, but it's not just, it's not just the end of summer. It's much more than that. It's got devilry in it. It's got evil spirits and all that mixed into that holiday. I'm not sure why.
It has death in there, and death is because it is that time of year when the days are, at least in the northern hemisphere, when the days are growing shorter, colder. You have to, in old days, this was the time of year when you started to worry about having enough food to get through the winter. It became a worrisome time to many people. It became a time in old Celtic lore when their major god and goddess assumed the aspect, the goddess, the Morrigan, assumed an aspect of an old hag, because it was a time when the crops were dying and the sun was dying. And
right.
So I think that's fairly clearly where we get that association with death. And of course, with nights becoming longer and colder, you get that association with spirits. The possibility of things crossing through on that night came from the old Celtic stories. The idea that it was a night when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. And they believed in an incredibly malicious form of fairies called the Sidhe. And when we talk about fairies, again, these things are totally scary in the original Celtic lore. These are not Tinkerbell with a little bit of an edge. These things are scary and dangerous, and they will cross over on that night, and they will kidnap people, and they will burn down palaces, and they will bring corpses back to life, and they do all kinds of terrible things.
And so they're going to be eradicated. That's the night to try and placate them, among other things.
Well, in the lore, though, they're not placated. They fight them. They have special enchanted spears and shields and so forth, and they fight these things. Occasionally, there are stories in the old Celtic lore of humans who do cross over and live in the fairy world and love it. And if they ever come back, they do so reluctantly. But for the most part, yes, the Sidhe were things to be feared and fought against.
If you'd like to try it yourself, walk widdershins around a church, particularly on Halloween night, and it will open up a gate to fairyland, but it's a one-way ticket most of the time, unless you can convince them to let you go. We do have a question from the comments. Carol asks, how do you address all the scary parts with any little kids you know?
I think that's a question for you, Kevin.
Well, the problem is the kids that I live with are really scary and like the scary stuff. They've grown up in a horror household, so they're okay with it.
I don't think it's something to be soft pedaled. I think that, first of all, kids can handle scares. We know that. And I'm very fond of Neil Gaiman's book Coraline. And, he often has talked about how adults sometimes don't get it, but the 10-year-olds do.
Yeah.
The 10-year-olds really get it and get the scary stuff. The same with the Graveyard Book. This is kid appropriate if it's done in a way that they understand. I'm not saying that we have to tell them, oh, this is all real, but I think they can handle it.
Yeah, young children especially know fear because they often live in it, and they're much closer to it than we have adults have sort of gotten rid of it in a sense, other than money for the mortgage or oh god, things at work. Our fear is no longer the dark or the monsters or that sort of thing. So kids are a lot more in touch with it, but also everything in popular culture teaches them about monster fighters, teaches them that not all monsters are monsters, that sometimes what is scaring you is just someone or something that's misunderstood, which is a very valuable lesson. Now, am I showing my kids Rob Zombie movies? No, because I'm a good parent. And that's not because they're scary. It's just, you have to set the level somewhere. But, the first time we showed them Hocus Pocus, they were not sure about it. They had real issues with Billy. But now my daughter's like, my daughter tells me when she's going to be ready to watch stuff. She's like, Dad, in about 2 more years, I want to watch Halloween with you. I'm like, oh, okay. I'll see you in 2025. We'll watch that. But they've caught sections of Trick or Treat and it doesn't bother them. And because, again, a lot of times little kids also understand pretend and make believe sometimes better than adults. We're just playing at it. It's not, and again, it helps for my kids that they have parents who are actors. So they've seen me in makeup, they've seen me eaten by zombies, and they're like, that zombie is really, really going for you, Dad. I'm like, yes, that's true.
Well, I've always argued that the purpose of horror fiction is practice. It's rehearsal for the scary things that we have to deal with in life. And so good kid level horror can be just that. It can be training. It can be okay. You're going to be okay. You're going to come out at the end of the tunnel. You're going to find that light switch to turn on the lights so you don't have to be afraid of the dark and so on.
My kids love Goosebumps and love Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. There is horror aimed at kids' ages that really help them. These are gateway drugs. But at the same time, if I may misquote Guillermo del Toro, horror is a roller coaster for the soul. And again, my children love roller coasters. So it's this sort of thing of none of this is really scary. We're just going to sit here and have fun being scared. Get on that roller coaster for the soul. And
we're probably not going to die. We're going to get off at the end of the ride. Scary as that ride is, they're probably not going to kill us because it's bad for business.
Another question from the comments. Lee, hello, Lee. Isn't it like 3 a.m. next Tuesday in New Zealand? Would the panelists like to speak of other cultural versions of Halloween, such as Asian Ghost Month celebrations? We can. You want me to start, or anyone have comments? Lisa?
I would push that one back for a moment just to talk a little about Dia de los Muertos, which is the one I get the most questions about, and that I think has the most interesting reflection against Halloween, because unlike the Asian celebrations, which don't have any direct influence with the Catholic missionaries, Dia de los Muertos does. And it's interesting because you get these same missionaries who had gone up to Ireland to convert the Celts are coming into Latin America, to Mexico mainly, and they are trying to, after Hernan Cortes, the conquistador, does his horrible things, they're trying to convert the indigenous peoples there now, mainly the Mayans, the Aztecs, and they're finding these existing celebrations that these people celebrated. And when you combine those Catholic traditions with those Latin American and Mexican and Mayan and Aztec celebrations, you get a very different holiday. It's not Halloween by any means. It's gorgeous. Dia de los Muertos is all about honoring your dead, your loved ones. They come back to visit you, which is somewhat similar to the Hungry Ghost Festival in Asia. And they are very beautiful in terms of creating altars to your loved ones and putting out their favorite foods and decorating their tombstones and their graves. This is not about prank playing or going house to house or trying to spook everyone. Or so it's interesting that this is what happens when you get these same people coming into a completely different area.
I would actually answer that question in two different ways. One is most cultures do have some sort of celebration of the dead. And I'll go with Japan because that's the one I'm most familiar with. You have Obon, of course, in August, which is, as Lisa pointed out, it's a familial thing. You're celebrating the ancestors. And in the way that Samhain perhaps originally was before it got commercialized. And there's, I think, some commercialization of Obon and all that because, and it's a cultural festival. And in fact, in August, that's when the Japanese would tell ghost stories. The most famous ghost plays are sort of set then, which, when you think about it, is brilliant. In a time before air conditioning, when everything's hot and humid, and trust me, Tokyo in August, oy vey, that's Japanese. It's very hot and humid. Tell ghost stories, and you get chills, and you are cooled. And just as a side note, I want to mention a particular Obon tradition that I love, the Hyaku Monogatari, the telling of 100 ghost stories. Gather together with friends at night, light a 100 candles, and tell a story and blow out a candle. And after 100 ghost stories, after the last candle is blown out, you're all sitting in the dark, and if the place is haunted, allegedly you'll be able to see the spirit. But it's also, samurai invented this sort of as a test of bravery. Can we sit in a room that's getting darker and darker and tell scarier and scarier stories? So that's a sort of Japanese Halloween thing. The second way I would answer this is Halloween has become one of America's great exports. I lived in England in the early 90s. There was no Halloween whatsoever. But if you go to London on October 31st right now, if you go to any major city, there's some Halloween stuff happening. If you go to Japan, when I was in Japan I first lived there in 96, there was no Halloween stuff. And now there are places in Tokyo that if you go on Halloween, you would not be able to tell the difference between there and West Hollywood. Just these huge celebrations of costumes and parties, that Halloween has become one of America's great exports in terms of just, let's dress up, let's have fun, let's do scary stuff. And it becomes an excuse to become someone else. As I like to joke, with both actors and horror writers, October is the month when everyone else pretends that they do what we do year round. They dress up and do scary things for this, 2-week period in October. And that's my 24/7, 365. That's why we're the Halloween people.
I'll add to that only an anecdote that I love, which is about how Halloween is catching on in mainland China, where people are still celebrating the Hungry Ghost Festival. And I read a delightful interview with a young person there who said they really loved Halloween because it was just fun, unlike their own festival, which was scary. So.
Yeah, Halloween tries to be scary, but if you've ever walked into a Halloween spirit store, most of the costumes are not scary. They're tied very much into popular culture. Or if you are in college age, everything is sexy. Sexy nurse, sexy acupuncturist, sexy Freddy Krueger. It sort of is an excuse for licentiousness and rowdiness and Bacchus and all the good things that happen in college anyway. Just now you do it in a costume.
Well, we have, I think, 5 minutes left. I don't know if we have any other questions or the sexy nun is not terrified. My all-time favorite sexy costume, by the way, was Sexy Corn. which remains one of the most inexplicable things I've ever seen. But we can probably wrap this up with a brief, let's have everybody here, Kevin and Les, tell us what you are working on right now and what we can expect to see coming soon from you.
I'll let Les start.
I am just starting work on an annotated edition of Lord Dunsany's stories that will be co-authored by Guillermo del Toro. So,
Oh, exciting. I am working on a few pieces of fiction, including one based on William Hope Hodgson for Jim Chambers. I'm also in the midst of writing a book for Hippocampus Press on the relationship between Lovecraft and the stage, looking at, I've just finished reading all of his letters and how much he writes about Shakespeare. And he lived in New York for 2 years and practically worshipped Eugene O'Neill. So there's all this interesting stuff. And then the second half of the book is, in the past 20 years or so, there's been an explosion of Lovecraft adaptations on the stage, good, bad, and ugly. So the book will be doing all of that. Lisa, what are you working on?
I have coming out on October 1st, my first big coffee table art book called The Art of the Zombie Movie. That was really fun to do. That's where most of my 2022 went to. I, like you, Kevin, will be in the William Hope Hodgson anthology with a story. And a number of short things, as always. And I will also have a novella out this December from Cemetery Dance. It was co-authored with John Palisano, and it is called Placerita. And it is actually based on a local LA urban legend about lizard people.
I think we should also mention that Lisa and I co-edited the together with Eric Wiater the Haunted Library of Horror Classics for the HWA. There are 8 volumes out, and the exciting news is that the series does seem to be starting up again, and there'll be more coming, hopefully as soon as later this year, but we'll see.
Oh, we have a question from Teal James. Hello, and hello, Brian, Lee, everyone here. This is probably a good one to end on. What are your predictions for the future of Halloween?
Hey, I get asked this all the time. And one of the things that I always just resort to is that I believe that it obviously is going to survive. It survived 9/11. It survived COVID. It came back from 9/11 at least stronger than ever. We're still kind of playing out the COVID recovery. But one of the things I've been predicting about it for 20 years is that it's going to mesh more and more with local or regional celebrations. We are seeing it here in LA. We're seeing Halloween and Dia de los Muertos coming together much more all the time. And they are seeing that in Mexico as well, with Halloween sort of infiltrating the other side of it. And I suspect we're going to see that all over the world more and more.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, as I was mentioning earlier, Halloween has become one of America's great exports. And I think you're going to see more and more international Halloween, but also locally transformed. Chinese Halloween is not the same as American. Japanese. British Halloween is not the same. And for them, it's just a holdover until Guy Fawkes Day anyway. The other prediction I'll make, sexy H.P. Lovecraft costume. It's going to hit. It's going to happen.
I guess I'm a little more cynical. I think that it will be more and more like Christmas. It'll just be an excuse to sell merchandise, and it'll persist as a holiday, but it'll persist because it's so important to the economy.
Yeah,
I think $1 billion in candy alone last year.
Yeah, and possibly in the haunted attractions industry as well. So it has become a gigantic money earner.
I suppose we'd see the expansion of Halloween to an almost year-round thing. Some of these haunted attractions stay open for much longer. So as Les points out, because it's such a moneymaker, I think we'll see the sort of Halloween, just as Christmas starts around, right after Labor Day and goes through mid-February. I think you're going to see the same thing with Halloween more and more.
Right. Yes, Costco is always a very good indicator of that. When it's like Labor Day and you can get your Halloween decorations, and in a few weeks after that, your Christmas.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's been a lot of fun to talk. As I predicted, I was able to listen a lot and learn a lot. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And those of you who are watching it in a recorded fashion, thank you for that as well. And we hope you will all consider visiting the HWA fundraiser for the scholarships. It is live right now. You can find links to it on, for example, my Facebook page, horror.org, all kinds of places. And please help us continue to offer those scholarships into the future. And with that,
everybody.
Thank you all.
Good night, everyone. Happy early Halloween.
Yes.
It's every day for some of us.
Oh, let's just lift. Now we can talk about them.